Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I thought I'd explain for a few of you what is the latest controversy over the Queen's speech that's going to be taking place this week. In fact, as you watch this tomorrow, if you're watching this as soon as it's come out anyway. So a Queen's speech is fairly normal usually, and what it does is it lays out the legislative programme for the government. But in this particular case, it's not doing that at all, and that's what I'm going to explain. But first, if you find yourself enjoying the video, then please click the like button and subscribe to the channel. So a little bit of catch up. So Boris Johnson, as Prime Minister, asked the Queen to prorogue Parliament or suspend it some time ago for 5 weeks. And he said the purpose of this was to prepare for a Queen's speech. It's always the purpose. It's the only legal purpose. You end one session of Parliament to begin another. The idea being that the government says, right, the legislation we wanted to get through in this session of Parliament has now been completed, or if there was any bits we couldn't get done, we're not going to get them done. So we now need to put our next plan into action, our next legislative plan into action. So we need to end this session, write the Queen's speech. The Queen will then explain what the government aims to do in this next session of Parliament, and away we go. So obviously the 5-week prorogation was deemed unlawful. You don't need 5 weeks to prepare a Queen's speech. You need basically one. There are some admin tasks, and the speech has to be written, and it has to be written on vellum as well. The Queen doesn't just get a print out and read out as well. There's lots of bits and pieces need doing, but it takes about a week. So 5 weeks was completely out. It was quite clear that Boris Johnson was doing that in order to stop Parliament holding him to account, which he basically successfully did, even though Parliament had to come back earlier than he'd planned. But last week he suspended Parliament again. Now, this time, no one could really do anything because everyone knew it wasn't for the purpose of a Queen's speech, but I'll come to that in a moment. But at the same time, he suspended it for a week. There is going to be a Queen's speech tomorrow, so no one could really say, well, no, you can't do that, because yes, he can. He's the Prime Minister. It's not, in many situations, unreasonable for a new Prime Minister to say, well, look, I've taken over from the last one because, you know, my party didn't really feel that they were getting the legislative programme right. So I'm going to have a new direction. And of course, it seems perfectly reasonable that you end that session of Parliament, start a new one and set out that legislative programme. Except for two things. The first of which is that Boris Johnson is not going to carry out the programme that the Queen is going to be reading out, and he can't possibly complete it in the new session of Parliament. And the reasons for this essentially are twofold. The first is that Boris Johnson is going to be seeking a general election. He has been seeking a general election for some weeks, but the opposition haven't been taking the bait. However, Jeremy Corbyn has said that once an extension to Brexit is secured, he will go for a general election. Now, that would also apply in the event of Boris Johnson managing to achieve his no-deal Brexit. Of course, Boris Johnson would then also go for a general election. So Jeremy Corbyn and Boris Johnson both want a general election. Boris Johnson would have preferred to have had it before the end of this month, but polls seem to be suggesting that even if he has to seek an extension, that a lot of his supporters will stay with him. So he may feel that he can do quite well out of a general election. Whether he's right or not is another matter, but he will feel that he can. Jeremy Corbyn definitely wants a general election, so the two of them together will have the numbers to push through for a general election, however they decide to do it. Probably before the end of this year. It's not likely to be November now, it's more likely to be December. Now, in a situation like that, of course, what he's going to be putting in the Queen's speech, he knows he's not going to complete. And then the second reason he can't do this is he doesn't have the numbers. Boris Johnson is the Prime Minister of a minority government in a very real sense of the word. He doesn't have any support at all. Now, you normally may think, well, how can he be Prime Minister? Well, he became Prime Minister when he did have a technical majority. You need a majority to become Prime Minister. You don't need a majority to remain Prime Minister. We can't get rid of one Prime Minister until another one comes to take their place. And no other MP at the moment has a majority of MPs behind them, so Boris Johnson remains in place. But what all this means is that Boris Johnson is going to be putting things in the Queen's speech that he knows he has no intention of achieving during this session of Parliament. So the whole thing is a sham. So why is he doing it, and why is it so controversial? The answer to both those questions is the same thing. He is effectively getting the Queen to read out a party political for the Conservative Party. What the Queen is going to be reading out is not the intentions of her government over the next session of Parliament, but of the Conservative Party in the event that they become a government after the next general election. That is a party political broadcast, and the fact that they're dragging the Queen into this, who is supposed to remain outside of politics, is what has a lot of people's backs up, and quite reasonably as well, because that is not what you're supposed to use the Queen for. The Queen is simply supposed to be laying out the agenda for the next session of Parliament. In a normal situation, it's perfectly uncontroversial, because although it's still party politics, in a normal situation, the party who writes the Queen's speech is the government, and they have the numbers to get through their legislation. This is definitely not the case now. And, you know, from my personal point of view, it's one of these situations where I would think, well, it's quite obvious to everyone with a brain that this is not a real Queen's speech. But that being said, there was absolutely no point in trying to take this to court. The judges wouldn't have been able to say anything, because at the end of the day, the suspension was for the right amount of time. It was already established during the court cases that a Prime Minister can call for a prorogation of Parliament for political purposes. The timing can be for their political advantage. That's been done before, and it's perfectly legal. And in terms of what he's saying on it, I mean, if Boris Johnson were at least saying, I don't want a general election, but if the opposition force one, well, I can't do much about that, then again, he might have some moral authority to say, well, I'm going ahead with the Queen's speech anyway, because it's my intention that this legislative programme is going to go through. But the bottom line, as I say, is he is actively seeking a general election, and he is not seeking to gain cross-party support for his legislation, which is absolutely essential to get anything through, because he does not have the MPs to pass a single piece of legislation, which is why Boris Johnson, even though he's been Prime Minister for a few months now, has not won a single vote in Parliament. He doesn't have the numbers. So hopefully that explains a little bit about the controversy. This is right up there with the fact that Boris Johnson is also using public money to promote Conservative Party policies in terms of the Brexit advertising as well, particularly as there is public money being spent on adverts telling people that we are leaving the EU on October the 31st, whereas at the moment the legal position is not unless the EU tell us we're not. From our point of view, it is no, we're not. We will find out next Saturday, of course. So I hope you found the video interesting. If you'd like to support the channel further, then please click the Patreon link for details. Until next time, I'll see you later.